Kia ora tātou and welcome back. Ko Phil Didham toko anua. My name's Phil Didham. I've had the privilege of being the chair of the planning committee for this conference, and I work in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the youth justice system there. So you've joined the work stream working together to improve the system, and we're in for some great presentations this afternoon. The thing to remember is that use the Q&A session if you have any questions to ask the presenters, and any questions that we can't answer during the time allotted, we will leave up so that the presenters can follow up afterwards. If you have any technical problems, there's a tech support live button to press and people will help you. I know we've had a few tech support issues today, but hopefully this will go well. And enjoy the session. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker, who's Susan Baidawi. She's a research fellow at the University of Monash, and she's funded by the Australian Research Council, a fellowship to called Discovery Early Career Research Award, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's about the knowledge base about those children who experience both the care system and the youth justice system. Often something that's called a crossover cohort, and something that I've got a strong interest in. So I'm looking forward to hearing Susan's speech.
Thanks, Phil. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend those respects to any First Nations people joining us today. As Phil said, I'll be speaking today about crossover children, and the particular focus I'm going to take today is on their educational experiences and outcomes. So just a bit about who are crossover children. I'm sure most people listening would know this today. They are children who are at the intersection of the child protection and youth justice systems. In the Australian context, we know that children notified to child protection systems are 9 times more likely to later come under youth justice supervision. And this overlap is more prominent at the youth justice end of the spectrum, where we know at least 50% of Australian children in custody are known to child protection services. This cohort experiences an earlier onset of police or youth justice contact, and that's associated with increased entrenchment in the youth justice systems and, unfortunately, an increased likelihood of progression to adult criminal justice systems. We also know that females and First Nations children are really overrepresented under the crossover children cohort, which has led to increasing policy and practice and research attention to this group. So why focus on education? Well, a lot of you come from a youth justice background and child protection background, and you'd know that there is generally a poorer academic status of both child protection and youth justice involved children. We see poorer reading, writing and numeracy compared with the general population in these cohorts, and unfortunately increased dropout and exclusion rates from school. Additionally, First Nations children are educationally disadvantaged even among these particular cohorts. And there's a range of individual, environmental and systemic challenges that lead to these outcomes and the exclusion of these groups of children from I guess, the educational systems. And not only that, we know that supporting education and training engagement is absolutely a key youth justice priority. It's associated with reducing risk of recidivism. And so there's individual practice implications in terms of working with individual young people, as well as policy level strategy implications from examining how to better improve the educational engagement of this group of children and young people. So some of the data I'm going to present today comes from an ongoing program of research I've been undertaking in partnership with the Children's Court here in Victoria. It's been funded by a range of people, including the Australian Research Council, Australian Institute of Criminology, and our Victorian then Department of Justice and Community Safety. The data I'll be working with today comes from a Children's Court sample that we've been collecting. It's of 600 children, 300 of whom are crossover children who have presented both before the criminal division of the court and have current or past child protection involvement. And the other 300 children are what we call a youth justice only cohort. So they only came before the criminal division of the court and don't have any statutory child protection involvement. Both of the groups of children were aged 10 to 17 years at the time of their alleged offending and appeared before one of 3 children's courts in the state of Victoria where we're based. The education-related data that I'll be presenting comes from both their child protection and youth justice reports, but also a range of other assessments and reports, for example, disability assessments and school psychologist reports. We also conducted a series of key stakeholder consultations, including with youth justice and child protection professionals, but a range of other stakeholders, including alternative education providers that I'll present some supplementary data from as well. So this first graph shows children sentenced to youth justice supervision only, so community or custodial sanctions, and looks at the differences in educational engagement and I guess outcomes between the crossover group in pink and the youth justice only group in blue. What we can see is there's some measures, there's quite some disparity. In particular, I want to draw your attention to the current educational engagement, where for the crossover cohort, only 14% were currently engaged in any education or training when they came before the Children's Court, the Criminal Division. In contrast, for the youth justice only group, we saw a much higher, albeit still problematic, level of 45% of children who are currently engaged with education. Again, there was a lot of disparity in terms of their alternative education engagement, with 70% of crossover children nearly having experienced those systems, compared with only 43% of youth justice only children. On other measures, there was quite similar outcomes. About equal proportions had experienced educational exclusion and had a history of classroom support, so kind of educational aids. So some differences, but some similarities. In terms of the crossover cohort, when we looked through the qualitative data in the files, educational disengagement in primary years was not uncommon, and it seemed to be related to a range of family, child, and systems level challenges. In terms of the family-related challenges, parental educational neglect, so not being able to engage with the child's school regarding the child's attendance or behaviour. Some children were not even enrolled in schools. Families also sometimes experience a lack of resources to support the child's education, for example, not having sufficient finances or being unable to drop the child even to school. And of course, ongoing abuse and family violence challenges in families also challenge children's educational engagement in primary years. But for the children themselves in primary school, some avoided school due to interpersonal conflicts and even things like bullying and racism in their primary years. But a lot of it came down to emotional and mental overwhelm of children with their family circumstances in terms of what disrupted their education in primary school. In terms of systems, we saw a number of children who experienced substantial placement changes that disrupted their education, and of course school exclusion, primarily in relation to emotional or behavioural regulation challenges. These same kind of challenges persisted in secondary school, but the additional challenges that we saw in the secondary years for crossover children in terms of their educational engagement was a range of like shame and anxiety and anticipated judgment or rejection, either in relation to their offending or being academically behind, or even anticipating future school exclusion that challenged them to keep engaged or re-engaged with education. Children often needed to also attend various appointments to manage their various health, welfare, youth justice and other legal needs. Some children were homeless or transitioning in and out of custodial youth justice and other secure environments. And less frequently, we saw some children whose own caring responsibilities, either to younger siblings or their own children, disrupted their education in secondary years. In terms of school exclusion, 1/3 of the crossover children whose cases we looked at had experienced school exclusion, and for 9% of children, this commenced from their primary school years, so suspensions or expulsions. School exclusion for crossover children was higher for males and also for children with a neurodisability and mental health diagnoses, as you'd expect. And there was some overlap between these groups, with males being about twice as likely to present with a neurodisability, a diagnosed one, compared to females. But the graph there presents, I guess, the proportion who had experienced school exclusion, and as you'd anticipate, higher for children with behavioural disorders, trauma and attachment-related disorders, and other neurodisabilities, for example, learning communication disorders and ADD or ADHD. So what were the ostensible reasons for school exclusion for crossover children? Well, things like poor attendance and truancy, not completing their schoolwork, sometimes sexually inappropriate behaviour at school or other dangerous or illegal behaviour in the school environment. We're starting to see in the Australian context increasing use of intervention orders to manage conflicts between students, and that leading to the exclusion of some students from school. And also, obviously, the highest amount came from oppositional, disruptive or aggressive behaviour in the school context. In terms of that behaviour, a lot of it seemed to come down to either mental health or neurodisability related presentations. So it's worth having a look at the difference between the neurodisability, the diagnosed neurodisabilities between the crossover group and the youth justice only group. So again, the crossover children here in the pink and the youth justice only cohort in the blue there. You can see higher levels, particularly of learning problems, ADHD, for the crossover children there. It's quite similar proportions with an intellectual disability that it's diagnosed, but overall a substantially increased or higher amount of the crossover cohort presenting with any diagnosed neurodisability. Similarly, when we looked at mental health, similar levels of mood disorders, so depression or anxiety in the crossover group, but much higher levels of trauma and attachment related disorders, conduct disorders, suicidal and self-harm behaviours, and overall mental health presentation. So I hope what you can take from the past two graphs is the increased complexity among the crossover cohort that basically will impact any kind of presentations in terms of their education. So those school behavioural and emotional regulation challenges was interesting to see when we looked at the qualitative and the narrative data in children's case files. These behavioural regulation challenges often seem to peak at other times when the child was experiencing adverse social and relational difficulties outside of the school environment. It wasn't always apparent that schools were aware of this. For example, things like escalating family violence at home, placement changes, children entering and exiting custody, where there's been a fractured parent-child relationship, particularly where there was some kind of element of rejection or parental relinquishment, even to out-of-home care. One really interesting thing we saw was a number of children had lost a parent or a parent figure by death, and this often related to a later increase in emotional and behavioural regulation challenges, and a number of children were seen to be suspended or expelled very soon after parental death. Current sexual abuse or assault or a recent abuse disclosure often led to increased emotional and behavioural regulation challenges as well. There was also a secondary form of educational exclusion for this cohort in terms of the difficulties they had in re-enrolling in school once they had been disengaged for whatever reason. Some of the reasons ostensibly were that it was the wrong time of the year for new enrolments, classes being full, schools lacking the appropriate program for a child. Sometimes children lack the evidence required to be enrolled, so their current address was uncertain due to placement changes, or they lacked even a birth certificate. Schools being unable to adhere to safety requirements or to subsidise the supports required for the child. And for some children, being too young to be able to be enrolled in the available alternative education options. And finally, some schools actually refuse to enrol children due to their educational history or criminal charges, and that's against the actual current legislation in the jurisdiction. I don't want to focus all on the negatives because we did see certainly examples of where positive educational gains were made for crossover children, and they tended to happen where there was a really good match between the child's need and the educational arrangement, where there was a responsive alternative educational arrangement, where somebody was supporting the child to attend school, and that usually was from child protection, youth justice, or even disability client services. Schools had good positive outcomes for children where they had the capacity to invest in the child, work closely with a care team, and where children had increased placement stability. And sometimes this came down to children being placed with a sibling. And interestingly, we often saw positive educational experiences for this group of children in youth justice custody, despite there being often previous substantial disengagement. Key stakeholder recommendations to improve educational engagement for this cohort focused on each system separately. Certainly, they saw a need to better resource the child protection system, particularly in the out-of-home care context, to better support children's educational engagement. Also to strengthen the education system itself in terms of its capacity to support children with complex needs. And finally, I guess most pertinent for this presentation and this audience, a need for ongoing advocacy and justice education strategies to support justice-involved children's education engagement. And I see that last one coming from the justice system as being probably the most important because it forms, I guess, more of a core of what the justice system is there to do in terms of needing to re-engage children with education in order to support assistance. So in summary, the educational disengagement and exclusion for this group of children is related to individual, family, care system and youth justice system factors. There's a more complex educational support needs profile in this cohort and does need targeted practice, policy and advocacy strategies to overcome those systemic barriers to meeting the educational needs of this group of children. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and thoughtful presentation with a lot of content and a lot of things to ponder on. What struck me is the fact that the child gets lost in the system between the education system and the care system and maybe the justice system. Each system is focused on meeting the needs of the majority and not focusing on the specific needs of the individual, and they get lost in the system. That's a sad thing. I haven't seen any questions in the Q&A, so unless you've got any final concluding comments, we'll move on to the next presentation.
Excellent.
Kieran, thank you. So now the second presentation is someone that I described as a veteran, but I didn't mean in terms of her age. I meant in terms of the fact that I think this is her second or third abstract being presented across these 3 days. And it's Kristie Dellar, who works in Banksia Hill Detention Centre in Western Australia for the Youth Psychology Services. Long background in looking at how we can tailor more effective interventions to the cohort of young people who end up at the pointy end of the youth justice system, and particularly presenting today on the relevance of the YLS CMI tool and its use in that setting. So handing over to Kristie now. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil, and I'm glad that you clarified there the veteran, not in terms of my age, so thank you for that. As Phil said, I'll be speaking to you today about the validation of the risk assessment tool, so the Youth Level of Service Case Management Inventory, so the YLS CMI, with the West Australian population. Before I get started, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land, sea and community, particularly the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, so the land on which this presentation takes place today. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. All right, so just to give a bit of context into why we thought this research was really important. So there is limited Australian data currently demonstrating the effectiveness of risk assessment tools, and there was no data at all on a West Australian juvenile offending population. So in Western Australia, we've got the highest rates of Indigenous youth in detention compared to all the other Australian states. And the youth offending population in West Australia, about 50% is made up of Indigenous youth. And in custody, that actually goes up to about 75% on any given day. So just looking at the monetary costs of detaining Indigenous youth in Western Australia, it's in excess of $30 million a year, which is quite a significant amount. So, and that's just looking at the monetary values and not even considering costs, victim costs, emotional, psychological costs of taking Indigenous youth off country and putting them in detention. So just looking at monetary costs on its own is quite significant. And that's why we thought it's really important to make sure that the risk assessment tools that we're using are validated and can tell us with reasonable accuracy which young people will go on to reoffend and which ones won't, and also where we should be focusing our resources to intervene with those higher risk youth so that we can really make sure we're actually having an impact in reducing those rates of reoffending and ultimately rates of overrepresentation here in WA. So we wanted to look at the Youth Level of Service Case Management Inventory. The tool was adopted by the West Australian Department of Justice in 2016, and basically wanted to look at, is it a reliable and valid measure of risk of reoffending for WA youth? And we wanted to also look at the subscales included in the tool to see if any of them were more predictive or if there was any differences in the risk factors between Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth. So our sample, as I said, the data was provided by the West Australian Department of Justice, and it included all the wireless assessments that have been completed since 2016, so since the tool was introduced. And we had just a little over 4,500 young people in the sample, and participants were ranging in age from 10 to 18. So the tool has been validated for that age range internationally. As you can see in our sample, majority of the young people were male, so almost 80%, and just over 60% were living in a metropolitan urban area, so surrounding the capital city of Perth. And as you can see, just over half of our sample identified as Indigenous. And in terms of the actual measure, so the YLS is a tool that assesses risk of reoffending. so recidivism. It has 42 items in total, and basically the total score will be summed and a category or risk level will be allocated to the young person. So they'll be rated as either a low, a moderate, high or very high risk of reoffending. And basically the total score, as it increases, the risk of reoffending increases. So we also had recidivism data for 921 young people in our sample with a minimum follow-up period of 2 years. So for the purpose of our research, recidivism was defined as any rearrest that occurred during that follow-up period. And then we also looked at subcategories of reoffending. So sexual reoffending, violent reoffending, sexual violence, substance-related offending, and then property, and any other type of offending just fell under the category of other. So in terms of our results, first of all, the tool demonstrated excellent internal consistency, so demonstrated to be a reliable measure of risk of reoffending. And in terms of validity, so what we found was there was a significant effect of gender. So what that meant for us in our sample was we found that males had significantly higher total scores compared to females, which is fairly consistent with other international national research. We also found there was a significant main effect of ethnicity. So in our sample, Indigenous young people also had significantly higher total scores compared to the non-Indigenous youth. Again, this is fairly consistent with international national research that tends to show minority groups do score higher, and often that is reflective of some of those experiences of racism, dislocation, colonisation that are also captured or increase the risk of exposure to risk factors for reoffending. We also found when we looked at the subcomponents that the Indigenous youth in our sample scored higher across all 8 of the subcomponents. But what was really interesting for the Indigenous youth in our sample, the most predictive factors were family circumstances and peer relationships. So the way the tool is designed, it's got the 8 subcomponents, and the user manual describes a focus on intrinsic factors when actually working with the young person. So that means that you should be focusing on things like attitudes, personality, leisure and recreation time, and substance abuse. And it actually says that the risk factors towards the lower end of the tool, which are considered more extrinsic, such as family circumstances and peers, as well as education, are less of a focus. So our research actually highlighted the opposite for Indigenous youth. So showing us that we really should be focusing our resources working with the families and those relationship functioning. And if we were to do that, we would have a much greater impact on reducing risk of reoffending. So in terms of predictive validity, so the tool did demonstrate with reasonable accuracy who will and will not go on to reoffend. So as you can see, we've broken it down into the total sample, followed by the gender and ethnicity. So we found that the tool was more predictive for males compared to females, and also more predictive for non-Indigenous youth in our sample compared to the Indigenous youth. Again, fairly consistent with international and national research. So in terms of recidivism data, our total rates of recidivism were 74.8%, which is quite high in comparison to international rates of recidivism and even other jurisdictions within Australia. So the reoffending rates elsewhere tend to hover around 50%, so ours were quite high. In terms of the types of reoffending, so the most common type of reoffending was property related, followed by violent offending and then substance use offending, with the least common reoffence being sexual reoffending. So in terms of just looking at Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth, so in our sample, Indigenous youth reoffended at a higher rate than non-Indigenous youth, so around 85% compared to 63%. We also found that the younger the offenders were in the sample, the quicker they were to reoffend, with young people aged 14 were the quickest to reoffend. And then what we found was over time, as the young people aged, the time to reoffending got longer and longer. So after 16, it took on average over 200 days to reoffend. So we also found that if the young person had an initial violent offence at the time of their assessment, they were 79.2% of those went on to reoffend, not necessarily with violence. Again, the most common type of reoffence was property. And we also found that young people who had an initial offence of sexual violence, 85% of those went on to reoffend, which is also quite significant. Again, not necessarily with sexual or violent reoffending, as the most common type of reoffending was property related. So to summarise the main findings of our research, we did gather empirical support for the use of the YLS tool as a reliable method for general risk assessments with the West Australian population. So we know that organisations that use structured and validated risk assessment tools are far more effective at introducing rehabilitative efforts and reducing reoffending than those that don't. So that was definitely a positive. And like I said, we also found that the tool with reasonable accuracy was able to tell us who will and will not go on to reoffend. We did find that it was more predictive for males compared to females in our sample, and the predictability was slightly lower for the Indigenous youth in our sample. One of the really key findings from our research was the specific risk factors or domains that came out as being more predictive for Indigenous youth in particular. So this really indicates to us where we should be allocating and focusing our resources and interventions to really target those dynamic risk factors and actually have a real impact on reducing reoffending. And like I said, introducing those numbers at the beginning, this is so important, in particular with Indigenous youth, because the rates of overrepresentation are so high. So the tool and the research has really given us a way forward in terms of where we should be focusing our resources and time. If anybody wants any more information about the research, we're always happy to have a further chat. So please feel free to contact myself or Lynn. Thank you.
An interesting presentation. We've had a look at YLS CMI here in New Zealand with mixed results. So it's interesting to see that research presented. As the last presentation, there were no questions that came in while the presentation was live, but some came in a bit later. So maybe when you move off screen, we can get you to go into the Q&A and answer any questions that we've missed. But one question I'd like to ask, and it's about sort of filtering for the quality of the person completing the assessment in terms of their training. We found in New Zealand that some of the issues that we had were with possibly inconsistency in applying the tool due to possibly a lack of training or understanding of the tool.
That's really interesting that you say that, because we've just actually completed an audit of the YLS assessments here in Western Australia, and we did have similar findings. And again, that's given us a way forward in terms of what training needs to continue. So everybody receives the same initial training, but what we found is that there's a real need for booster trainings over time, about every 6 months or so.
That would make a lot of sense. Is there a way that that the young people themselves can contribute to the scoring or reflect on the scoring? Is there a kind of self-assessment portion of the tool? So
you're not able to complete a YLS without actually interviewing the young person. So it's necessary to do the tool to actually speak to the young person, and there is a set guide of questions that need to be asked. And there is also, as part of the manual and the assessment process, the assessor is supposed to meet with the young person and provide them feedback on what actually came out of the tool and what areas might need to be focused on. And that is an opportunity for that young person to have their input and say whether they agree or disagree, if they think there's other areas that are more important for them to focus on. And I think that in particular for Indigenous youth is really important, because we often find that what they think is more important for them to focus on, or what they actually need to help them stay out of trouble, is not what we think or what might come up as highest on the tool. So that is a really important thing, to really have that discussion and feedback with the young person.
Of course. I guess it's difficult to quantify in terms of your research, but was there any evidence that once a young person had scored highly, that the approach to them was differentiated in a negative way, that they were in some way stigmatized or targeted, rather than get the right intensity or the right services? Was there any negative implications of being rated high?
Not that came out through our research. I certainly hear what you're saying, and there's definitely one of the criticisms of using tools such as the wireless has been that potential to negatively label the young person, or have negative impacts, I guess, of them being seen as a high risk. But from our research, we didn't find that.
That's good. That's good to hear. That's really interesting. Okay. I can't see any other questions. So if there's any concluding remarks, I think we'll move on. But thanks again for all your contributions to the conference, and particularly this one today. I found that a really interesting session. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil.
So we're now going to move on to the third in this sequence of presentations. And off screen, I've had Keisha Hopgood and Jenny Luvrik, who've been grinning away in the green room. I don't know whether that's hysteria because they've had some functionality issues with their slides, but I'm sure that everything's fixed now and it will be good for the next session. So Keisha and Jenny both have a legal background. Keisha is the managing solicitor in the Aboriginal Legal Services for ACT and New South Wales. And Jenny works for that awesome organisation, Just Reinvest New South Wales. And those of you who were present for Daniel and Isaiah's presentation yesterday know a little bit about the work of that organisation. And Jenny also has a background in criminal law, particularly legal aid and advocacy for people who maybe struggle to get good legal representation. So two people who really at the pointy end talking to young people at their point of most need, and they're going to talk about reimagining bail. So over to Keisha and Jenny.
Great. Thank you. I hope everyone can hear us. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge I'm here in Redfern on beautiful Gadigal country, on land that is never ceded, and I pay my respects to present and emerging. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Look, we have had a few technical issues, but hopefully this works smoothly. As you heard from Phil, my name is Keisha. I'm from the Aboriginal Legal Service, and this is Jenny. We were a bit ambitious when we put together this proposal. Didn't realise it was 20 minutes. So what we are going to do, there's some big issues in this, but we're going to really focus on a couple of those. What we're going to do is briefly look at bail law in New South Wales, just to give those people who don't have a background in the area a bit of a grounding. Then we're going to discuss a little bit about short-term remand and look at some of that data briefly. And then we're going to look at two projects that both Just Reinvest and the Aboriginal Legal Service have been involved in, aimed at reducing short-term remand. One of those is a collaborative project with DCJ, so Department of Communities and Justice, New South Wales Police, Legal Aid, ALS, Just Reinvest, and a whole heap of other stakeholders working in this space. The second one is a bail project aimed at supporting young people to not breach their bail, but by making sure that those bail conditions are appropriate and not too onerous. And that's based in one of our regional towns, Moree.
It's a big presentation. There's a lot of information here. We're really happy for you to contact us afterwards, and our email addresses are on the screen. Please, we love talking about this stuff, so we're really happy for you to contact us.
Thank you. Okay, so as I said, a bit of a background to bail in New South Wales. New South Wales has what's called an unacceptable risk test. What that requires is the police and the courts, when looking at bail for either an adult or a young person, is to look at a number of bail concerns, assess those bail concerns, and determine whether there is an unacceptable risk. If there is, then bail refusal is mandatory. If there's not, then the grant of bail is also mandatory. If there's a grant of bail, that can be bail with or without conditions, or the person can or the court or the police could actually release the person without bail or dispense with bail. In terms of those unacceptable risk concerns, there are 4 of those you'll see on your screen at the moment. Failing to appear at court, committing a serious offence, and the Bail Act guidance as to what's a serious offence, endangering the safety of victims, individuals or the community, or interfering with witnesses or evidence. For the most part, it's focused on community protection though when you come to court. Okay, you'll see a screen full of words at the moment. Section 18 of the Bail Act in New South Wales gives a mandatory and an exhaustive list of matters that the police and the court consider when they're determining bail. Not going to go through all of those clearly. They go from A all the way through to S, but I will draw your attention to K. You'll see that on your screen highlighted. Any special vulnerability or needs the accused person has, including because of youth, being an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, or having a cognitive or mental health impairment. Again, and it's another whole topic of conversation or presentation to focus on that. What we say is that it would be good to have bail legislation specific for youth, and it would be great to have a standalone provision for Aboriginality, just to really draw attention to those two very important factors.
So what is short-term remand? Short-term remand, as we are talking about today, is when children or young people are arrested, placed on remand, and then released by a magistrate within 24 hours.
Yeah. So the reason why we're looking at that is because, as I just said, both the New South Wales Police and the courts apply that unacceptable risk. But the Bail Act doesn't provide any guidance as to how those enumerated A through to S, Section 18 matters should be weighed or integrated. And so what we see is a huge discrepancy in the outcome of that decision-making between police at first instance and then court when the young person's brought before the court if police do refuse bail. Huge discrepancy, and that's what we're looking at the moment, that discrepancy of outcome as to short-term remand.
So in terms of the incidence of short-term remand, there has been quite a bit of analysis on this. An internal report by DCJ, that's the Committee on Justice, found that almost half of children and young people arrested and placed on remand are released within 24 hours. So that's an extraordinary percentage of children who are unnecessarily spending time in remand. And of approximately 1,500 instances of children and young people experiencing remand over a year, over 12 months, only 6% were ultimately sentenced to a control order, which meant that all those young people were spending time in remand where should have gone to full sentence, they would have not spent any time inside.
Yeah, and that's a really important point to note, is that when we think about bail, and again, times we won't go into this, but when we talk about the purpose of bail, really important to note that we weren't really moving towards a model, or we have moved towards a model of preventative detention. And I think it's a really important statistic that when you look at less than 6%, under 100 of those 1,489 kids actually ultimately got a control-based order. So we were locking them up for breaching bail conditions or for the initial offence that they never then got dealt with by way of a control order. I will just say, in terms of the short-term remand being an issue, we certainly acknowledge that there is an appropriate level of difference between police and court decision-making. There will be times for perhaps the availability of information or police doing their job, they've got a different role than the courts, that there will be some discrepancy in that decision-making, but not the 50% that Jenny just referred to, and not in this context where so few of them are actually being dealt with by way of control. So what we did at the ALS was we also really wanted to understand this issue, and we wanted to, one, see what the instance of short-term remand was, and also kind of look at any kind of barriers to improving that situation and get a real sense of perhaps why it existed in the first place. As I said, there's definitely a different role for police and courts, but we wanted to understand a bit more about what was leading to that discrepancy. What we found was in our matters across, we looked at a number of categories. We looked at when someone just commits an offence in and of itself, or when someone commits an offence on bail, or when someone just breaches their bail. Across all those categories, there was 60% of young people, so young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, that experienced short-term remand. In the breach of bail category, there was almost 80% of the young people experienced short-term remand. So again, just to remind you what that meant was 80% of the kids that the police had refused bail were granted bail by the courts within 24 hours. You'll see a link on your screen, or an address, a web address to our snapshot, our short-term remand snapshot that we put together. Again, you know, if you have a read and you've got any questions, certainly feel free to reach out. That breach of bail category, again, is another whole presentation in itself.
You can see we've just noted some boxer. That's a Bureau of Crime Stats and Research agency in New South Wales, and some analysis of short-term remand data there showed that in the 3 years to June 2020, an average of 155 young people were detained for 24 hours each month. So that's an extraordinary number of people spending time inside.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the harm of short-term remand. So why are we so concerned with this? Obviously, the numbers are very concerning, but we do know that young people and indeed their families who are vulnerable, being kept in remand is a very traumatic experience. We also know, you know, one of the things that we want to do in this space is ensure that young people don't spend any time in police custody. We don't want people to be habituated to that. We also know that youth detention is closely associated with later incarceration life as an adult. So anything we can do to avoid short-term remand, we hope will have long-term implications. And if we can change practices, we hope to make a long-term impact there. We also know that bail, spending time in remand and going through these processes is incredibly cost inefficient. It costs the government a whole lot. And our view, I suppose, especially from a justice reinvestment perspective, is that, you know, that's a lost opportunity. That money would be far better spent on doing therapeutic supports and early intervention for young people to help keep them out of trouble in the first place.
Okay, so as I said, we then, we're trying to look at what are those barriers to improving this situation, and what are some of the reasons why, or factors that are leading to this discrepancy between police and court decision making when it comes to bail. We did a bit of a study, as I said, through our short-term remand and through this collaborative work, and we identified, if I phrase it this way, that police were applying an adult lens to bail decision making. As I said at the start of this, the Bail Act in New South Wales applies to both kids and adults. There is that little section 18K that references youth, but if you are dealing all day with adults and all of a sudden a young person comes along, it's not, I guess it makes sense that there may still be an adult lens that you're viewing that issue through, that bail decision through. I'll give you an example of the kind of common matter that comes up for us. So this is an example of a case study that we had. I'm going to call this young boy Jacob. Jacob was only 10 years old. He had autism. He had a mum his mum also had quite significant mental health issues. They got involved to a bit of a disagreement at home, and Jacob assaulted his mum. He then did a bit of a runner, and when the police came to the house, he was no longer there. He later presented himself at the police station with his dad, and the police at that time then arrested him, and bail refused him. And the reason for that was the seriousness of the offence. Now, no one's going to quibble with the fact that domestic violence is a serious offence and needs an appropriate response. But this was a 10-year-old boy with autism and some significant issues that we knew was never going to be bail refused by the court. And indeed, that's what happened. He went to court and he bail, but he did go, as I said, under arrest, handcuffed, into police custody, spent that time in custody. He didn't have to go into youth detention, so he did get before court that day. But in a lot of these examples, this is just indicative of what happens all the time. In a lot of these examples, a young person is taken to youth detention because they've missed court cutoff. And in youth detention, on entry, then people do have to go through what they call a partial strip search or partial clothing search, which is the removal of clothes. So if you can think about the impact as well on that on a young person. And again, just reminding you, so what we're talking about is avoidable short-term remand. One of our responses to that was, again, everyone was really collaborative. We had this group that came together with police and everyone and talked about how those decisions are making. We shared the tools, that the court shared the tools they use, police shared the tools they use to come to that decision, and looked at where perhaps there was a deviation. One of the responses was the preparation of some guidelines by the court. So one of the magistrates, in conjunction or consultation with others, put together some guidelines on the Bail Act and its application to young people. That's a fabulous resource. It's only just been finalised and put up on the New South Wales Children's Court website. You'll see that link on your page as well. But definitely worth a look, and we're hoping that'll then filter through and provide some guidance and perhaps be incorporated even into police training. Another part of our response to this was to recognise that we really needed to understand what the situation was, obviously, and those barriers. And the best way of doing that was going to the young people themselves. So the consultation group, the short-term remand working group and a short-term remand steering committee determined that one of the responses was to define what we meant by youth-centred approach and then put that into practice. What's happening at the moment, just about to be rolled out. COVID put a bit of a dampener on things over here in terms of visits to youth detention centres, but just about to be rolled out is a process whereby through youth justice, going into detention centres, Cobham at the start, and speaking to young people and their families as well about their experiences and their views of remand and ideas they have. A really vital part of the solution. The second project we were looking at is in Moree, which Jenny will speak to in a moment. That came about because, again, one of the barriers or the issues involved in short-term remand that was identified was that there could be the imposition, and there was indeed, the imposition of inappropriate or onerous bail conditions, which of course increase the likelihood of breach of bail, which again flows to increasing the likelihood of detention and short-term remand. The Bail Act in New South Wales does provide some restriction on the type of conditions that can be imposed. So Section 20A of the Bail Act does provide that they need to be reasonably necessary, not onerous, need to take into account that young person could comply with them. Basically, utilises principles of proportionality. But what we do know is, despite that, there are conditions that are being put in place that are inappropriate and they are onerous, which led to this particular project.
Thanks, Keisha. Yeah, so this project does aim to address that issue of kind of, in many ways, an unthinking way of putting on bail conditions, which, should there be some more thought around it and some more oversight of those bail conditions, will hopefully lead to less instances of bail breaches and therefore less instances of short-term remand. So Just Reinvest New South Wales has been doing some work with the Moree community for some time, and a big focus of our work up there is on young people and putting young people at the centre of decision making. We have been working on this project again in a very collaborative way with the Aboriginal Legal Service, Keisha, with Just Reinvest New South Wales, with the local police command in Moree, which is a smallish town in regional remote New South Wales with a very large Aboriginal population, as well as with the police command, with the Deputy Commissioner. So the idea again is to encourage more appropriate and less onerous bail conditions. We are trying this in Moree, and we're hopefully going to do the same in Mount Druitt early next year. So through the project, we are actually getting real-time access to fact sheets, charges, and most importantly, bail conditions in police. So they are sending those information to a standalone email address, and they are being assessed really quickly. Once we look at those bail conditions, look at the fact sheet and the charges, we can make an assessment, or the ALS makes an assessment on whether those bail conditions are varied, and if they should be, working with the client to get those matters listed before the court for variation. Importantly, we're working with the local community organisations, because there will be a bunch of young people out there in community whose circumstances change. So people's living arrangements, who they're staying with, what they're doing changes all the time. So the idea is to work with those young people whose circumstances are such that they may be at high risk of breaching their current bail conditions. And once again, seeking to have those matters varied as appropriate before the court. Importantly, this is also a way of testing a different way of working with police. So, and that is working really well in Moree so far. Early days on this project, again, COVID has got in the way of a kind of fulsome rollout of this project. But so far we're seeing probably better police attention to bail law, and we're possibly seeing less onerous bail conditions, possibly less bail refusals, and that kind of goes to a kind of different mindset around bail.
Yeah. So just to give you a bit of case study on that one, when we talk about onerous or inappropriate bail conditions, I looked at one of our examples was for another one of our young fellows. I'm going to call him Jake. Jake was 11, and Jake had a background where he had very sadly been a victim of sustained sexual abuse. That the perpetrator of that had been sentenced, and following that sentence, Jake had started to really struggle a bit, a lot actually. Jake ended up on bail. He was self-harming and getting himself into trouble, mainly at home. And he, as I said, he ended up on bail. The police went round to his house one day for an unrelated matter, and Jake wasn't at home. He had on his bail a bail condition that he was to attend school. Now, again, you can put a hat on and think that's a great protective factor to go to school. We know that that's important for young people, that engagement, that support, and that we know the corollary of that when they're not at school, how things can go wrong. But putting it as a bail condition meant that when, as I said, when police went to the house and he wasn't at school, he was arrested for breach of bail, taken into police custody. He then was given bail at court, but again, we've got a really traumatised young person who's taken into custody, subject to all of that all that involves before he's granted bail by the court. In terms of a great example of those, as some changes we saw, what we did was we meet regularly with police. It's been really good at opening those lines of communication and really facilitating that relationship. And to consider two bail conditions that were often routinely applied by police, we spoke about. So rather than on each individual matter having to run and list it before the court and do something about it that way, we just had a chat where we said, look, this condition about, I'll just use one of them now, noting the time, but this condition of be of good behaviour is going to cause some problems. Again, you can put a hat on, be of good behaviour makes sense. We want people to be on bail, not getting in trouble. But the way good behaviour was being interpreted, or I should say it was open to interpretation. So someone got into a fight with their sibling and no charges were laid, but that was a breach of good behaviour. Good behaviour very clearly could mean don't commit an offence, or it could mean do what mum says and eat your veggies. So it's open to interpretation. We talked to the police about that and they agreed to stop putting that condition on their bail. So if they wanted a condition which was to commit no offences, they could put a condition on that which said do not commit any offences. So that's just one way. One other very quick example that police gave us feedback about was what Jenny referred to in that bit of the changing of the minds and that cultural shift. A young person had been bail refused by police, taken to court, granted bail. Then the police became aware of some of that predated that. And when they became aware of that, they were very honestly said, normally we would have bail refused for those ones because they were serious, and that's what we would have done. But when they then considered it more deeply, they thought, well, he has just been granted by bail by the court. He has just been given those bail conditions. This offence predates that. We know how this will end at court. We're going to put him on police bail on the same conditions that the court placed this young person on. So it's early days yet, but we're already seeing some great success and looking forward to extending that into 2022 at Mount Druitt, as Jenny said. Thank you, everyone.
Slides worked and you came through loud and clear, so that was great. A couple of questions. One is, what can be done to support frontline criminal justice professionals to make sure that there are better bail decisions made? So what can we do to help our frontline youth justice professionals?
To help, just so I understand the question, to help them help young people? I guess you can't check that up.
I think I'll do a bit of editorializing if I'm allowed, and sometimes our youth justice professionals are the least respected voice in that setting, that more power and weight is given to maybe the prosecution or the police or a judicial view. And how can we make sure that our people speak with confidence and authority when police are beginning to make the decisions on arrest, or when the court are beginning to consider what can we do to strengthen that voice, I think.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. We're very lucky here in New South Wales in that when our youth justice officers do speak in court and they are asked for their views by the court, they are really listened to because they know the young people, they know the background, they know where that young person's at the moment in terms of what supports they have or what is being put in place. So how to strengthen that? I mean, maybe would be if they do speak to the lawyer. So this is something where it's at court. They speak to the lawyer and they find out what those issues are, what are going to be the sticking points with the court. And so when they then speak to their great knowledge that they have of that young person and the broader issues, they can ground it as well in terms of the legal side of it, that the court's going to be focusing on, or the prosecution's going to be addressing. I mean, that's a really just a practical kind of notion, but I think perhaps speaking to the lawyers about what is the language, what part of the Bail Act and the particular legislation that applies there would those concerns fit into, and how can they better be heard?
Yeah, and I think some adding value to the process, so that kind of special knowledge that worker may have, that can give to the lawyer they can make those submissions, and it can give the court, the prosecution, some comfort that there are issues going on and they're actually being addressed in the background, which may have some more remedial effect. And in fact, then again, develop those relationships between the players in the courtroom for the young person's benefit.
Thank you. There's another question which is about, are you seeing a transformation, a change in police and courts thinking around specific bail conditions? Are people being a bit more nuanced and tailored in the way they're making bail conditions? I know you said in the presentation that there was a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to bail conditions that didn't really hit the spot for some young people. So are you seeing that transformation, more considered approach to what the bail conditions should be?
I'll get Keisha to answer the body of that, but I think people are very alert to these very alarming short-term remand statistics. And we now have access to those by police command, and you know, they're kind of under the spotlight. So I think there is some sense that we do actually have to change this. This is the same act. We're having very different decisions coming out here, what's going on in the process. And I think it is making police have a bit more thought around it. And I think in terms of the kind of instances, Keisha, have you got anything?
Yeah, I think Jenny's right. I think I'm really comforted by some changes that I see happening, and I find that collaborative group, the short-term remand group, and the steering committee that's was initially set up by DCJ and has just grown, and it's got great commitment from all these organisations, and it's a really open forum where people really, police share the tools they use. It's really transparent sharing of information. I'm really comforted by that and the changes that are being made. It's not going to change overnight, and it's a long process, and there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of work to be done, particularly in some of the regional areas, in terms of changing that police culture and that one-size-fits-all approach. So look, we're still seeing. If I went back out into the office, I would have one on my desk today as to a matter where there'd been an inappropriate or an onerous bail condition, or some awful situation where someone had been arrested when there should have been a diversionary option taken instead. But yeah, definitely seeing a shift and a commitment from stakeholders to making that shift, definitely. We're very lucky also here that we have a specialist children's court jurisdiction and some specialist magistrates within that, and they're definitely across it. It's just again about filtering that out. And look, I'm really honest too, in that I think even as a defence lawyer, for a long time we've also been part of the problem. I'm not saying that we don't advocate strongly for our clients, that we do, but you kind of fall into a habit. So if there's a tricky bail decision before the court, and it is a serious offence, and it did happen at night, you're offering something to the court to give the court comfort that they're doing something by placing, for example, a curfew on that bail condition. And I think we just need to all make sure that we actually take that step back and say, is that what this is really about? Is that curfew really going to stop or support everything that's going on behind the scenes for that young person that offending? Or is it just making us all feel better that we've ticked a box and we've done something? But yeah, look, in answer to that question, lots to do, but we've made a start.
Okay, but look, thanks. And I think this conversation could go on. And I think one of the key points for me is that you can impose conditions, or you can work with a young person to help them succeed on bail, or you can use bail as a weapon to make sure they get remanded. And I'd rather see us use everything we've got in our toolbox and give young people the chance of succeeding on bail. So thanks for your presentation. Thanks to all the three presenters in this session. It's been really insightful, and I've enjoyed all three, and I could probably talk forever, particularly on this last one, but a break calls, so enjoy your 20 minutes away from the headphones and the screen, and we'll see you back here at 10 to 2, I think. Thank you.